The Blade of Sorrow sang its siren song, a discordant melody that echoed through the ages, a sound that could twist the very air around it into knots of despair. Those who dared to grasp its hilt were granted terrible power, but at a price that blackened their souls, an eternal darkness creeping from their fingertips to their very hearts. Legends whispered of its origins, how it had been forged in the molten fires of a dying star, each strike of the hammer resonating with the death throes of a celestial body. It was said to have been quenched in the blood of a fallen god, whose death cry still reverberated within the blade's cruel edge. For centuries it had carved a crimson path across the realms, passed from hand to corrupted hand, each wielder meeting a fate more gruesome than the last. The blade demanded blood, and it always exacted its due. Heroes and tyrants alike had fallen under its sway, their names forgotten, their deeds swallowed by the shadows of the sword's insatiable hunger. Now Elowen stood before the latest of the sword's puppets, her breath ragged, her armor splattered with gore that still steamed in the chill air. The battle had been fierce, and the ground was littered with the bodies of the fallen. Her chest heaved from exertion, her muscles quivering with the strain of a fight that had tested her to her very core. At her feet lay the mangled corpse of the blade's last victim, its limbs twisted and broken, yet still it twitched as if some dark energy clung to its bones, reluctant to let go. Dark tendrils of shadow seeped from its body, curling like smoke on the breeze. Elowen's eyes burned with the light of the Radiant One, the divine spark that had guided her every step. She had trained her entire life for this moment, chosen by the Radiant One to be her champion, a vessel of light in a world that had long since forgotten the sun. She could feel the weight of that responsibility, the fate of her people hanging in the balance like a sword above her head. And now, as she stared down at the Blade of Sorrows, lying in the dirt like a venomous snake coiled and waiting, she knew her true test had only just begun. Her fingers closed around the ornate hilt, cold and sharp to the touch, and she felt the sword's malevolent presence invade her mind like a creeping fog. It seeped into the cracks of her thoughts, oily and insistent, whispering in a voice that was both seductive and terrifying.
"Take me up,"
it murmured, 1,000 voices speaking as one.
"Let us bathe the world in darkness."
Elowen gritted her teeth, every muscle in her body tensing as she fought the sword's insidious influence. Her grip tightened, knuckles whitening. She could feel it, the dark tendrils coiling around her will, probing for weakness.
No.
She growled through clenched teeth, her voice a defiant snarl.
I serve the Radiant One. My people need me.
But with each passing heartbeat, the sword's grip tightened, its whispers growing more urgent, more insistent. Visions of power and conquest flooded her senses, sweeping her away like a leaf in a raging torrent. She saw herself, standing atop mountains of corpses, her enemies laid low before her. She felt the thrill of it, the intoxicating rush of unbridled power, of bending the world to her will.
"Your god has abandoned you,"
the blade insisted, its voice now a smooth purr in her thoughts.
"I alone can grant you the strength to save your people."
For a moment, Elowen's resolve wavered. The weight of her quest bore down upon her, and the sword offered an easy path, a shortcut through all the suffering and loss. Just one small compromise.
Perhaps,
she whispered, her voice hoarse, barely more than a breath.
Perhaps you're right.
As the words left her lips, Elowen felt something fundamental shift within her. It was like a thread being pulled from a tapestry, unraveling her very essence. The Blade of Sorrow's triumphant laughter echoed in the chambers of her mind, a cacophony that drowned out all else. The shadows surged, consuming the last flickers of her former self. When Elowen's eyes snapped open, they gleamed with an unholy light, cold and cruel as a winter's dawn. The champion of the Radiant One was no more. In her place stood a new wielder of the Blade of Sorrows, a creature born of darkness, ready to carve her own blood-soaked legend across the realms. The world blurred and shifted around Elowen as she strode forth from the chamber, the Blade of Sorrows singing its discordant melody with each step, a terrible hymn to a new age of darkness. Inside her mind, the true Elowen screamed and raged, a prisoner in her own flesh, her voice like a faint echo in a deep, dark well. But her cries went unheard, drowned out by the sword's malevolent whispers.
"We have work to do, little champion."
The blade purred, its voice thick with satisfaction.
Your people await their salvation.
Elowen's body moved of its own accord, guided by the sword's will. Villages and towns passed in a haze of fire and blood. With each life taken, the blade's power grew, and Elowen felt herself slipping further away, like a fading memory in a dream that had long since turned to nightmare. Months passed, or perhaps years. The passage of time had lost all meaning. The Blade of Sorrows was a constant presence, a shadow over her soul, and its hunger was endless. Months passed, or perhaps years. The passage of time had lost all meaning. The Blade of Sorrows was a constant presence, a shadow over her soul, and its hunger was endless. Elowen found herself standing before an alabaster temple, its spires reaching towards the heavens like pleading hands. The Temple of the Radiant One. Here she was meant to complete her second trial, to prove her worth as the chosen champion.
How fitting.
Elowen's lips curled into a cruel smile, the blade's voice spilling from her mouth like poison.
We shall show your god the true meaning of radiance.
Thought temple doors swung open at her approach, revealing a cavernous hall bathed in golden light. Priests and acolytes turned, their faces lighting up at the sight of their long-awaited champion. But their joy twisted to horror as Elowen raised the Blade of Sorrows high, the dark energy crackling around its edge.
Behold,
She bellowed, her voice resonating with unnatural power, a dreadful mockery of divine proclamation.
I bring you salvation.
The blade sang as it tore through flesh and bone, each stroke a symphony of death. Blood splattered across the pristine marble floors, defiling the sacred space. The screams of the innocent filled the air, a stark contrast to the eerie silence that followed each kill. With every life taken, the golden light dimmed, replaced by creeping shadows that spread like a stain. Deep within her mind, the true Elowen wept. This was not salvation, but damnation. This was not what she had been chosen for. As the last priest fell, the temple trembled, the very stones crying out in anguish. The statue of the Radiant One at the far end of the hall began to crack, a brilliant golden light seeping through the fissures. It was the light of hope, of something that could not be easily snuffed out.
Yes.
The blade hissed in anticipation, a serpent coiling to strike.
Break the seal. Let us feast on divinity itself.
Elowen's body moved forward, the sword raised high above her head, its hunger a palpable thing. But, as she prepared to strike the final blow, a voice cut through the carnage. A voice that Elowen recognized from the deepest reaches of her soul.
My child.
The Radiant One spoke, her voice filled with sorrow and compassion, each word a gentle caress.
What have you become?
For a moment, Elowen felt the blade's grip on her mind waver, like a knot being loosened. In that instant of clarity, she saw the full weight of her actions, the devastation she had wrought, the blood that stained her hands. She saw the faces of those she had slain, not enemies but innocents. With every ounce of will she possessed, she fought against the sword's control, a desperate, final plea.
Help me.
She whispered, her true voice breaking through for the first time in what felt like an eternity, raw and trembling with grief and regret. The Radiant One's light flared, filling the desecrated temple with a brilliance that burned away the shadows. The Blade of Sorrows screamed in Elowen's mind, a high, keening wail of fury and fear, its hold beginning to slip. But the battle for Elowen's soul had only just begun, and the fate of realms hung in the balance, teetering on the edge of a blade. Elowen's breath came in ragged gas, her body a vessel for shadow and torment. For an instant, the Radiant One's light pierced the gloom, and the blade's grasp weakened, but it was just an instant, a mere flicker.
No!
The Blade of Sorrow shrieked, its voice like steel dragged across stone. Its fury was a tempest, and Elowen's spirit buckled under the storm. The darkness surged back, slamming into her like a tide of blackened iron. The light of the Radiant One's compassion dimmed, and Elowen's fleeting clarity drowned in shadows. Elowen's mouth twisted into a snarl, her body no longer her own. The blade surged with power, feeding on the blood already spilled, and it hungered. The whispers returned, louder, more insistent, a chorus of despair.
You will be mine.
It hissed.
And through you this world shall bow.
The temple trembled beneath them as the battle erupted. The Radiant One's light flared, filling the hall with searing brilliance. For a heartbeat, Elowen's eyes widened in defiance, but then her lips curled into a savage grin and she lunged. A blade of light met a blade of shadow. When they clashed, it was the sound of creation tearing asunder. Marble split and flew like jagged teeth from a gaping maw. The blade of sorrows guided Elowen's hand with deadly precision, its dark aura cutting through divine light like ink bleeding into water. Each strike sent cracks running through the walls, up the mighty pillars, down to the very foundations.
Remember who you are.
The Radiant One cried, her voice ringing with ancient power. She unleashed a torrent of holy fire, her eyes aflame with both fury and grief. But the Elowen who answered was no longer the one who had once prayed to her.
I am reborn.
She snarled, her voice a rasping mockery of what it had been. She lashed out with a vicious arc of her blade, cutting through fire and air, sending ripples of darkness to swallow the light. The Radiant One faltered, and for a moment her gaze met Elowen's, searching for the soul she once knew. But all she found was the void, filled with a shadow that echoed with bitter laughter.
Do you mourn your loss, goddess?
Elowen taunted, her voice entwined with the blade's venomous malice.
Do you weep for what you could not save?
The goddess's response was a radiant wave, her very essence turned weapon. But Elowen stood her ground. A storm of fury and darkness poured from her, meeting the divine onslaught head-on. The temple could bear no more. It shattered around them, exploding outward as the mountain itself began to groan and splinter under the force of their clash. As the dust of stone and faith settled, the mountain quaked, torn asunder by the divine conflict. The temple, once a bastion of light, was reduced to a ruin perched on a crumbling peak. And there, amid the devastation, the Radiant One knelt, her divine form flickering like a guttering flame.
Please, Elowen.
She whispered, her voice now tinged with exhaustion, with regret.
Remember your people, remember.
But Elowen, no, the thing she had become, only grinned. She raised the blade high, and with a cry that shattered the heavens, she plunged it deep into the Radiant One's chest. The blade drank deep, its siren song rising to a fevered pitch. It consumed the divine light, devouring it with a ravenous hunger that knew no bounds. The goddess's eyes widened, not with pain, but with a sorrow that stretched across eons. Elowen felt it then, the surge of unimaginable power flooding through her veins, the radiant essence of a god. But it was no gentle illumination. It was raw, unfiltered might, and it tore through her like wildfire. Her flesh twisted, bones cracking as shadows and light warred within her. She could feel herself changing, becoming something beyond mortal comprehension, something monstrous. The light of the Radiant One was snuffed out, and with it, the last sanctuary of hope. Elowen stood in the wreckage, her form distorted, horrifying, a creature born of both divinity and the darkest abyss. Her skin was a lattice of radiant scars and shadowy veins, her eyes twin voids that swallowed all light. The blade of sorrows had become one with her, fused to her arm, its malevolence seeping into her very soul. The mountain groaned as it collapsed, a fitting grave for the fallen goddess and the last vestige of purity in the world. And atop its ruin, the new Elowen, no longer champion, no longer mortal, cast her gaze upon the realms below. She could feel it, the terror spreading like wildfire, a new legend born in blood and shadow. And deep within her, Elowen's true self screamed into the darkness, knowing there was no escape from the nightmare she had become, and no other choice but to embrace it. I want to first apologize for the late release. This story will be a two-part story. I will release part 2 this coming Friday. I have had quite a few things going on that prevented me from getting this story done as one whole story. Thank you for listening to the story, and to all of the new subscribers, I say welcome to the fold. Until next time.